The evening sun scorched the canyon walls, casting long shadows over the cracked earth. Farmer Clark Hudson trudged along the dry riverbed, his traps empty and his back aching. The wind carried the scent of dust and charred brush, but it was something else that made him stop cold. A filthy blanket lay crumpled near a cluster of jagged rocks. It twitched. Clark's heart thudded. He crouched, reaching toward the bundle. "Don't wait for sundown." A raspy whisper came from beneath it. Clark froze. The words hung in the heavy air. With careful hands, he pulled back the blanket and froze again. Beneath lay a girl no older than 17. Her clothes were torn, her skin raw and scarred, and across her stomach burned letters, RE07. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his, pleading. She was half dead, branded like cattle, and Clark Hudson realized the world outside his lonely ranch had found a way to drag him back in. Clark Hudson had not always been a man of solitude. Once, he had ridden under the cavalry banner, the wind in his face and the weight of duty heavy on his shoulders. Back then, the horizon had seemed limitless, the world full of purpose. He and his brother, Samuel, had scouted for the regiment, navigating canyons, plains, and riverbeds with a precision born of countless drills. Clark had trusted in the order of things, the clarity of a uniform, the certainty of commands, the loyalty between brothers. But war, as it often does, had taught him the cruel arithmetic of loss. One evening, during a scouting mission near the Bitter Creek, an ambush had taken Samuel's life. Clark had been too far ahead to stop it, too slow to turn the tide. The memory haunted him in every silence. The crack of gunfire, the scream, the brother's body falling into the dust. In the aftermath, Clark had felt a hollowness spread within him, a gnawing conviction that the world was filled with suffering beyond his control. He had sworn a vow, one that clung to him like a second skin, never again to entangle himself in the lives of others. After the war, Clark had returned to what remained of his family's property on the fringe of the wasteland. The land was unforgiving. Cracked earth, jagged rocks, and windswept plains that seemed to stretch endlessly. Yet in that harshness, Clark found a measure of peace. He rebuilt a small ranch, enough to keep a handful of cattle and a modest vegetable garden. A corral for a horse, a well for water, and a cabin with a creaking wooden porch became his universe. The wilderness around him, empty of people, was the only society he trusted. Neighbors existed, but their voices and visits were rare. He learned their routines only from a distance, through flickering lanterns and hoarse hoofbeats. Years passed like this. Clark lived among the silence and the wind, rising at dawn, tending his land, repairing fences, mending traps. The rustle of the canyon brush became his company, the howl of coyotes at night his lullaby. He avoided the market towns, the small gatherings, the festivals that brought noise and laughter that now felt alien. Every day followed a predictable rhythm, a methodical sequence that left no room for chaos or the entanglement of human drama. In those years of isolation, he had built walls around himself, walls thick with mistrust and grief, bricks cemented by the memory of Samuel's death. The world outside his ranch became a distant rumor, a story told in passing and quickly forgotten. He told himself he had chosen this life. Solitude was safety, safety was survival, survival was enough. Clark had long convinced himself that the emptiness around him was not loneliness, but a shield. It was simpler than facing the unpredictability of people, their desires, their cruelties. And yet, despite the seclusion, Clark's past clung to him like shadow. He could not forget the faces of the lost, the bloodied hands of a war he survived, the anguish of mothers and fathers who had received no closure. He remembered the young men he had led, trusting him with their lives, who never returned. At night, he sometimes lay awake, counting stars he had once ridden under, wondering if any of them would look down and whisper forgiveness. But he turned these thoughts aside, hardening his heart against intrusion. Clark had long ago buried the man who believed in heroics, in rescue, in justice beyond survival. He cultivated a routine: morning chores, noon meals, evening repairs, and nights spent by the fire, reading tattered books or polishing his rifle. He observed the world from a distance, his only interactions transactional. A sack of grain, a barrel of water, or the occasional neighbor who nodded from afar. He was careful never to let anyone get close. People brought complications, and complications brought pain. His solitude was a fortress, and he intended to remain behind its walls until death called him, or until the desert reclaimed him. Yet fate has a stubborn way of ignoring vows. That evening, as the sun bled red across the canyon, the battered girl lying beneath the filthy blanket challenged every principle he had enforced. Clark could not turn away, not when the words "Don't wait for sundown" cut through the canyon wind and pierced his carefully constructed isolation. The girl's scars, the burned letters on her flesh, and the raw terror in her eyes demanded action. In that instant, the walls of his past life began to crack. The world he had shut out was knocking, and he was faced with a choice he had believed he would never make: to intervene, or to watch another life become another tragedy he could not prevent. Clark knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. Each scar told a story, each branded letter a warning. He realized that no matter how carefully he had insulated himself, the past was not gone. It had only waited, lying in ambush like the shadows of the canyon cliffs. The quiet man who had retreated from the world now faced a life screaming for rescue. And for the first time in years, Clark Hudson felt the stirrings of purpose once more. A dangerous, fragile, yet undeniable purpose that would challenge every rule he had lived by. He helped her to sit, keeping his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs. The desert's wind carried a strange mix of scents: dust, sagebrush, and something metallic he could not place. His pulse quickened. The girl, Ellie Mae, as she would soon tell him, was alive but only barely. He had no plan, no allies, no clear path. And yet, as he looked at her, a memory surfaced. The promise he had made to himself after Samuel's death, to avoid suffering, but now twisted, reshaped, demanding that he act, that he protect, that he face a world he had tried to abandon. In that canyon, with shadows stretching and fire-colored skies closing in, Clark Hudson understood that life would never allow him the comfort of indifference again. The past had forged him, the present had summoned him, and the future, whatever horrors it held, would demand his courage. And so, with hands scarred by years of toil but steady with a newfound resolve, he lifted the girl from the riverbed, carrying her toward the faint safety of his lonely ranch, where the walls of solitude would meet the first test of their strength. The girl's weight was nearly nothing in Clark's arms, but it felt like carrying the weight of the canyon itself. Her head lolled against his shoulder, hair matted with dirt and blood. She whispered again, barely audible over the wind that rattled the canyon walls. "Please, don't let them find me before sundown." Clark's brows furrowed. The words carried desperation but also something else, a hidden warning. He tightened his grip, careful not to jostle her injuries, and kept moving. Every step on the loose rocks and cracked earth sent a tremor through him. He had known hardship, seen men die, had endured hunger, thirst, and despair. But this was different. The girl exuded a terror that burned into the marrow of his bones. He carried her in silence for miles, the wind carrying the scent of smoke from distant brush fires. The canyon seemed to close around them, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower. Clark's mind worked furiously, calculating distance, thinking of the safest route to the ranch. But more than that, he studied her. The branding on her torso was deep and precise, letters burned into her flesh with a cruel artistry. RHC 07. That number alone spoke of systematic cruelty, of ownership, and of a machinery of horror Clark had never imagined. When he reached the edge of his property, the cabin loomed like a fortress against the fading light. Clark eased the girl inside, laying her gently on a cot he had prepared with fresh blankets. He pulled off his coat and wrapped her, careful not to touch her burns. She trembled violently, shivering with fever or fear, perhaps both. He ran a wet cloth over the worst of the burns, cleaned what could be cleaned, and examined the bruises that covered her arms and legs. "Who did this to you?" Clark asked quietly, but she could not answer. Her lips moved, forming words he could not understand, as if the pain had stolen her voice. Her eyes, wide and luminous, scanned the room as if expecting someone to burst through the door. Clark knew then that her fear was rooted not only in physical torment but in something deeper, something systematic and deliberate. As night fell, the shadows of the cabin seemed to grow longer, more oppressive. Clark lit the oil lamp and set it on the table, illuminating her face. She flinched at the light, blinking as though it burned her eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted a hand and traced the letters branded on her stomach. They own me, she whispered. I'm number 7. Clark froze. The sound of the words, coupled with the mark itself, triggered memories long buried. Reports from his days as a scout, rumors he had refused to investigate, whispers of towns where girls disappeared and returned broken. He felt the old, familiar ache in his chest, the knowledge of atrocities he could not prevent. And yet now, the opportunity to act was laid bare in front of him, and he felt an unfamiliar sense of responsibility stirring. I'm Clark Hudson, he said gently. You're safe here. For now. Her eyes flickered toward him, a mixture of suspicion and fragile hope. Safe? She asked, voice quivering. They'll come. They always come. Clark nodded slowly. He had anticipated as much. From the branding to her whispering plea, the signs were unmistakable. Whoever had marked her, whoever had tortured her, would not simply allow her to vanish. And Clark realized he could not run from this. The promise he had made to himself after Samuel's death, the vow to avoid suffering, to not entangle himself in others' lives, was being challenged by a force he could not ignore. Then we prepare, he said, his voice low but firm. No one takes you back. Not while I'm breathing. Ellie Mae, as she finally whispered her name, nodded weakly, though the fear in her eyes did not waver. Clark saw in that nod not just acceptance but a silent plea for protection, and he felt a pang of something he had not felt in years. Purpose. It was dangerous, messy, and terrifying, but undeniably alive. Hours passed, and Clark kept watch by the window, rifle within reach. The night was silent, but every rustle outside made him flinch, every distant howl of a coyote feel like a warning. He learned quickly. Ellie was weak, malnourished, and traumatized. Yet beneath the terror, there was defiance. She refused to let despair fully claim her. Even with fevered lips and trembling limbs, her eyes held a spark, a stubborn refusal to be broken entirely. Over the next days, Clark tended her with methodical care. He bandaged burns, brewed herbal teas to ease fever, and spoke to her quietly to soothe panic attacks. At night, when sleep eluded him, he polished his rifle and mapped the surrounding canyon, calculating every potential approach an enemy might take. The ranch, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a fortress under siege. And in this fortress, a bond began to form, one built not on friendship, not on comfort, but on the raw, immediate necessity of survival. Despite her weakened state, Ellie shared fragments of her story. She spoke of the town of Red Hollow, the people in power, and the ledger that cataloged girls like her, owned, abused, hidden. Her voice was fragile, but the words cut like steel. Clark listened, absorbing each detail, recognizing that what they faced was larger than a single girl, larger than any one act of cruelty. The network, the organization, the town itself, they were all implicated. And for the first time in years, Clark understood that the world he had turned away from was now pressing its weight upon him. When the first riders came, men with rifles, shouting his name and demanding number 7, Clark did not hesitate. The walls of his quiet life had been breached, and his past life of isolation offered no protection. With steady hands and a heart steeled by long years of discipline, he confronted them, firing once to stop one and capturing another. The man, trembling and bloodied, spoke truths that chilled the air. The mayor of Red Hollow, Walter Briggs, wanted Ellie returned. And Clark knew then that their quiet life was over. The girl, barely able to sit upright, looked at him with wide eyes. "They'll kill us both," she whispered. Clark met her gaze. "Then we fight," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen death and chosen to face it, rather than flee. "And we survive. That's what we do." That night, as the wind carried the cries of distant coyotes, Clark Hudson made a decision that would shatter the solitude of his past and launch him into a battle that would challenge every skill, every instinct, and every principle he had cultivated in his years of isolation. He had carried Ellie Mae from the canyon, but now he would carry her into a world of danger, corruption, and justice yet unclaimed. The wind rattled the cabin. The shadows danced across the walls, and Ellie Mae Collins whispered one final time before sleep took her, "Thank you for hearing me." Clark watched her, knowing that he had heard more than just a plea. He had heard a summons, a call to a life he had thought he left behind, and he would answer it whatever the cost. Clark Hudson had spent years in isolation, yet nothing had prepared him for what it meant to carry Ellie Mae Collins into a fight he never sought. His cabin, once a refuge of silence, became a fortress overnight. Every nail, every plank of wood, every ridge of the surrounding cliffs was scrutinized, measured, catalogued in his mind as potential defense. Supplies were secured. Rifles were cleaned and tested, bullets counted with meticulous care. He worked in near silence, broken only by the soft groans of Ellie as she rested on a cot, pale and fevered, yet burning with a stubborn, raw defiance that reminded him painfully of his lost brother. The first night passed in tense vigilance. Clark sat by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the shadows. Every gust of wind, every creak of wood, every distant coyote cry felt like an intruder testing the perimeter. Ellie stirred, whispering broken fragments of names, of faces, of places where others like her had been taken. Clark listened, committing every detail to memory. He realized she was not only a victim but a repository of knowledge that could dismantle a network built on cruelty and fear. When dawn came, he carried her outside to fetch water from the well. The air was crisp and dry, the canyon stretching into a haze of heat and dust. Ellie's skin still bore the marks of her torment, the burned letters, the bruises, the deep cuts, but she moved with a determination that belied her weakened state. "I won't survive out there," she murmured, her voice weak but fierce. "Not unless you help me." Clark had long sworn never to entangle himself in another life, but this was no ordinary choice. It was not a matter of morality or heroism. It was survival, and perhaps something deeper, a long-buried sense of justice awakened. He hoisted her onto the horse he had tamed years ago, brushing the dust from its mane, and rode slowly toward the perimeter of his land, keeping a vigilant eye on the canyon walls. The first signs of pursuit appeared at midday, distant hoofbeats that echoed against the canyon cliffs. Clark slowed, scanning the ridges, the gullies, the dry riverbeds. He could see men moving with purpose, rifles slung, eyes searching. The merciless efficiency in their movement told him they were professionals, and one thing was certain, they were coming for number 7. Clark did not panic. He had faced ambushes before, in wars that had left scars on his body and soul. He guided Ellie into a narrow ravine where the cliffs rose like sentinels, and dismounted, letting the horse graze behind a rock formation. Ellie's small frame trembled against his side, and he murmured reassurances he did not fully believe himself. "They will not take you," he said. "Not while I can breathe, not while I can aim." The riders came closer, shouting names, threats, and demands for her return. Clark met them with calm precision. The first man broke through the brush, rifle raised, but Clark's years as a scout, his intimate knowledge of terrain, and his steady hands made the difference. The shot rang out, echoing across the canyon, and one man went down, blood blooming across his chest. The others faltered, shocked by the sudden violence. Clark pressed forward, capturing one of the attackers, binding him with rope from his supplies. The prisoner, terrified and trembling, spoke quickly, words spilling out like a torrent. The mayor of Red Hollow, Walter Briggs, wanted her returned at all costs. Clark listened, absorbing the details, forming a mental map of corruption, cruelty, and manipulation. Every name, every place, every ritualistic act of violence added clarity to a horrifying puzzle. Ellie's terror became a guide, her knowledge a key to dismantling the network that had branded her. Back at the ranch, Clark worked tirelessly. He treated Ellie's wounds with care, cleaned and bandaged what he could, and fortified the perimeter. He constructed crude alarms, tin cans strung across fence lines, small bells hidden in brush, to alert them to movement. The ranch became a nexus of preparation, a quiet stage for an inevitable confrontation. Clark understood that survival required more than hiding. It required strategy, calculation, and resolve sharpened by necessity. Ellie, despite weakness, contributed what she could. She whispered details about the men, their routines, and their hierarchy, helping Clark anticipate their moves. With each passing day, her spirit, though battered, grew stronger. The small gestures of defiance, a lifted chin, a steady gaze, a whispered plan, fueled Clark's determination. He began to see her not only as a survivor needing protection, but as a partner in a mission that had become larger than either of them. As the sun set one evening, the horizon painted in shades of blood and fire, Clark prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He reviewed every potential path of attack, memorized every ridge and gully, and checked his rifle repeatedly. Ellie watched him, her eyes reflecting fear and trust, understanding that the quiet man who had lived for years in solitude had transformed into a sentinel ready to face relentless evil. When the riders came again, they found not a defenseless girl but a man who had spent years honing precision and patience, and a girl who, despite everything, refused to be broken. Clark fired once, twice, and then moved with a predator's grace, capturing the second man and using his own words to map the enemy's plans. Each shot, each command, each strategic maneuver was guided by years of skill and the moral compass that had been reignited by Ellie's plight. By nightfall, they had survived the first wave. Clark knew more waves were coming, that Walter Briggs would stop at nothing, that Red Hollow's corruption extended far beyond the town. Yet in that moment he felt a fragile, dangerous hope. The girl he had rescued, once a symbol of suffering, now stood at his side, a spark of defiance amid the desolation. Clark Hudson, once a man who had fled the world to protect himself from grief and cruelty, now understood the truth. Some calls could not be ignored, some lives demanded intervention, and some battles, however perilous, must be fought. The ranch had become their staging ground, the canyon their ally, and their resolve the weapon against those who trafficked in cruelty. And as the moon rose over the canyon, casting silver light over the rugged landscape, Clark made a vow to himself and to Ellie Mae Collins. They would face the coming storm together, and they would not falter. The quiet life he had cultivated for years was over. The fight had begun, and there was no turning back. The sun rose pale over the canyon, casting long, trembling shadows across Clark Hudson's ranch. The quiet he had once cherished no longer existed. Each gust of wind carried the threat of discovery. Each distant bird call reminded him that the world beyond his walls had returned, relentless and dangerous. Ellie Mae Collins sat wrapped in blankets, her fevered brow pressed against the wooden table as she whispered fragments of information that had survived her torment. Clark listened intently, piecing together the network that had sought to claim her, the organized cruelty that ran like a current beneath the towns, ranches, and streets of the wastelands. Clark knew they could not stay hidden forever. Red Hollow was closer than he had imagined, a town gleaming under a veneer of civility while hiding atrocities beneath. Ellie had described the ledger, the names of those complicit, and the hidden chambers under a theater where women were kept like livestock. He understood now that the threat was systemic. It was not a single villain but a network of people who had allowed abuse and cruelty to flourish unchecked. Each day spent in hiding was a day closer to discovery, a day closer to the reach of Walter Briggs. He spent the morning reinforcing the perimeter. Stakes were driven deep into the earth around the corral, sharp stones placed along likely approaches, and tripwires fashioned from rope and tin cans. Clark moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had studied every inch of land for decades, anticipating each footstep, each shadow. Ellie watched, offering small corrections and whispered observations. "They'll use the ravine east of the creek," she said, voice weak but steady. "Two men, one with a rifle always first." Clark nodded, silently grateful for her insight. Together, they turned his ranch into a fortress of preparation, blending experience with intelligence born of her survival. By mid-afternoon, Clark decided they would take the fight to the edge. They could not wait for an assault that might come at any hour. Riding cautiously toward the outskirts of Red Hollow, he kept to hidden trails and ridges, avoiding main roads and open fields. Ellie clung to him, still weak, still pale, but her spirit seemed to strengthen with each mile. She whispered details of the town's hidden passages, the locations of guards, and the hierarchy of those who had enslaved her and others. Clark absorbed each detail, mentally marking escape routes, ambush points, and possible allies. The town itself appeared deceptively calm. Red Hollow gleamed under the afternoon sun with its newly painted buildings, a theater that glittered with signs of prosperity, and citizens bustling in the streets. But Clark's instincts told him this was a surface, a thin veneer over a rotting core. He remembered the ledger, the hidden chambers, the names of men in power who trafficked in human lives. Every smiling face could be a threat. Every cheer in the marketplace might conceal complicity. They moved cautiously, finding hidden alleys and shaded corners, avoiding attention while gathering evidence, while Clark's mind worked through contingencies and calculations, preparing for confrontation. Night fell, and Clark led Ellie to a small, abandoned storage house near the outskirts, using it as a temporary observation post. From a high window, he could see the theater, its facade innocent, its basement doors locked and guarded. He whispered to Ellie, outlining the plan. They would infiltrate the theater, find the ledger, and gather evidence of the atrocities that had been committed. Her eyes widened, but she nodded, determination flickering through fear. "We expose them," she said. "We show the town what they've done." Clark's pulse quickened. This was no longer merely protection. It was justice, retribution, a confrontation that would demand every ounce of skill, every memory of survival, every instinct honed from years of solitude and war. He felt the weight of responsibility more acutely than he had ever felt in his life. The lives of countless women depended on their success. One wrong step could mean the end for Ellie, the end for the captured, and a return to the horrors that had marked her flesh. The first challenges arrived sooner than expected. Guards patrolled the alleys, eyes sharp, weapons at the ready. Clark and Ellie moved with careful precision, ducking behind crates, slipping through shadows, and memorizing patterns of surveillance. They discovered an entrance to a hidden basement beneath the theater, partially concealed behind a false wall in the cellar. Clark pried the wall open just enough to slip through, the air thick with dust and the faint metallic scent of fear and decay. Inside, they found the hidden chambers. Women, gaunt and terrified, looked up as the intruders entered. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly, lost in trauma. Ellie gasped softly, her own suffering mirrored in their hollow eyes. Clark's heart ached, but he pushed aside emotion. There was work to be done. They moved quickly, gathering documents, ledgers and records, photographing and memorizing names, understanding the breadth of the corruption that had allowed Walter Briggs and his allies to prosper. As they exited, Clark understood that this was only the beginning. The threat had grown beyond a single girl or even a single town. The system was entrenched, pervasive, and merciless. And yet, for the first time in years, Clark Hudson felt alive, his purpose renewed. He was no longer a recluse avoiding life's chaos. He was a man confronting it, fully aware that the danger had multiplied and the consequences would be severe. Back at the ranch, they laid out the evidence, planning the next move. Red Hollow would not know what hid it. The ledger, the hidden chambers, the names of those complicit, all would be revealed. And Clark understood this truth. The enemy would never stop, and neither could he. They had lit a spark in the darkness, and now that spark would grow into a fire that could not be extinguished. As the night settled over the canyon, Clark and Ellie prepared for the confrontation to come. They would face Walter Briggs, the mayor, and the town's hidden network. They would expose the corruption, protect the innocent, and fight with every skill and ounce of courage they possessed. And through it all, Clark knew this. Once he had stepped forward, there was no turning back. The threat had grown, but so had his resolve, sharpened by grief, by loss, and by the fragile hope that justice could prevail. The sun rose over Red Hollow with a false sense of serenity, painting the streets in gold and shadow, as though nothing sinister lurked beneath the surface. Clark Hudson and Ellie Mae Collins moved silently through the early morning mist, their eyes fixed on the town square and the looming theater at its edge. Every step carried weight. Every breath was calculated. Clark felt the old tension of his cavalry days returning, the quiet, watchful alertness before the chaos of battle. Only this time, the stakes were different. Lives depended on their courage, and justice demanded exposure. Clark had planned every move, memorized the positions of guards, and mapped escape routes, yet uncertainty gnawed at him. He carried the ledger in a satchel, each page a testament to horrors inflicted in silence. Names of judges, preachers, and even the sheriff himself, people who had used authority as a weapon to subjugate the innocent. Ellie walked beside him, her body healed enough to support the mission, her eyes fierce and unwavering. For the first time, she no longer seemed like a fragile survivor. She was a partner, a living symbol of resistance. As they approached the town square, Clark noticed the mayor, Walter Briggs, standing on the theater steps, flanked by men who had once been invisible, complicit in the town's corruption. Briggs smiled, a sickly, confident smile, unaware that his secrets were no longer hidden. Clark's heart thumped, the rhythm of urgency and determination intertwining with the wind that carried the scent of dust and smoldering fire. He strode into the square, the ledger heavy against his side. The townspeople paused, their chatter dying to whispers of curiosity and fear. Clark stopped before Briggs, holding the satchel aloft. "I know every name and every price," he shouted, voice booming across the square. The crowd recoiled, shock and recognition rippling like water through the mass of people. Ellie stepped forward, removing the scarf that had hidden the branded mark on her stomach. The letters R207 glinted in the sunlight, raw and undeniable. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Briggs's confident smile faltered, then twisted into anger. His hand went to his pocket, reaching for a weapon, but hesitation slowed him. He had underestimated the resolve of those he thought powerless. A figure moved from the crowd, Martha Jenkins, the blacksmith's widow, her hands trembling as she raised her old Winchester. Her daughter had once been taken, her suffering mirrored in the eyes of the women who now began to stir, whispering names and stories in hushed tones. The first shot rang out, cutting through the morning calm. Chaos erupted. Citizens screamed, some fleeing, some joining the uprising. Clark fired with precision, disabling 2 guards who had tried to approach. Ellie shouted names, helping identify those complicit, directing the brave, guiding the frightened. The townspeople, once silent in fear, began to act. Women rushed from hidden chambers beneath the theater, faces pale but eyes alight with hope. They overpowered guards, locked doors behind them, and moved to free those still trapped. Clark moved with practiced skill, coordinating attacks and ensuring the ledger was placed in view of all, a manifesto of accountability. Briggs tried to flee, but the growing tide of citizens and survivors cornered him. The mayor's threats fell on deaf ears as Clark stepped forward, rifle raised, forcing him to the ground. Smoke began to curl from the theater as fires ignited, a mixture of vengeance and symbolism. The town square filled with a chaotic symphony. The screams of the guilty, the cries of the liberated, and the sounds of struggle that were a testament to both cruelty and courage. Clark, moving swiftly and decisively, ensured that the women were evacuated safely, guiding them into hidden alleys and safe houses he had pre-identified in the surrounding town. Ellie stayed close, helping those too weak to move, offering reassurance with words, touch, and presence. The confrontation reached its peak in the theater itself. Clark faced Briggs and his closest men, who had gathered weapons in a last attempt to reassert control. Each shot Clark fired was deliberate, each movement calculated, honed by years of survival instincts and the urgency of protecting the innocent. The last of Briggs's men fell, disarmed and terrified, and Clark stood over the mayor as he pleaded for mercy that would not come. The ledger, now open for all to see, bore witness to his crimes. Clark's gaze was unwavering, reflecting both justice and the cost of prolonged inaction by an entire town. When the fires consumed the theater, the townspeople watched from the square, some crying, some cheering, some numb. The liberation was brutal, messy, and final. Clark and Ellie stood side by side, observing the flames licking the wooden beams, understanding that their mission had altered the town forever. The corrupt power that had governed through fear was broken. The ledger had been revealed, the hidden chambers emptied, and the women freed. Yet Clark knew the battle was not over. The network had roots, the scars would remain, and the enemy might yet strike again. Ellie looked at Clark, her hand brushing against the branded letters on her stomach, and whispered, "We did it. They can't hurt us now." Clark's response was measured, acknowledging both victory and vigilance. "We did for today," he said. "Tomorrow is another fight, but for now they know the truth." As the smoke rose over Red Hollow, Clark realized the profound transformation within himself. The man who had once lived in solitude, avoiding the world and its tragedies, had become a guardian, a strategist, a force capable of confronting the worst human cruelty. Ellie's courage had rekindled his own, proving that purpose, even delayed, could shape destiny. The town square, now chaotic with freed voices and burning evidence of oppression, echoed with a single undeniable truth. Justice had arrived, even if only temporarily, and those who had lived in fear could finally breathe. Clark Hudson and Ellie Mae Collins had ignited the first dawn of a reckoning that would forever alter Red Hollow's history. The fires of Red Hollow smoldered in the distance as Clark Hudson and Ellie Mae Collins rode away from the chaos, the acrid smoke curling behind them, mingling with the canyon wind. The town was no longer the glittering facade it had once pretended to be. Now the surface had been stripped away, exposing corruption, cruelty, and greed. The ledger, evidence of crimes committed under the veneer of civility, had done its work, and the women who had suffered in silence were finally free. Yet, Clark knew the cost of survival was never negligible, and the memories of those who had been lost would remain. The path back to the wastelands was quiet, save for the occasional call of a distant coyote or the rustle of wind through the scrub. Ellie sat on the horse behind Clark, her fingers brushing the rough fabric of his coat. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, where the sky met the arid plains in shades of orange and violet. She was no longer the terrified girl who had whispered, "Don't wait for sundown." She was a survivor, her spirit tempered by suffering but unbroken, her eyes now carrying a quiet defiance that matched Clark's own resolve. They traveled in silence for miles, the echoes of Red Hollow receding behind them. Clark's mind worked tirelessly, calculating routes, hiding spots, and potential dangers that might still lurk in the wastelands. The network that had branded Ellie was larger than any single town. He knew that, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, fragile yet real, knowing that he had acted decisively, that justice had been served in the immediate sense, and that more could be done if necessary. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they reached a secluded valley, its cliffs forming a natural barrier against any pursuit. Clark dismounted and helped Ellie to her feet, guiding her to a small spring hidden among rocks. The water was cold, refreshing, and for a moment, the two simply drank in silence, listening to the gentle burble of the stream and the distant howl of coyotes. The world felt expansive and unthreatening here, a stark contrast to the violence and fear they had left behind. Clark surveyed the land and began envisioning a refuge, a place where women like Ellie could find safety, far from the reach of corrupt towns and predatory men. He imagined small cabins, gardens, fences, and watchtowers. Every detail was considered, every potential hazard anticipated. Ellie watched him, her expression shifting from exhaustion to cautious hope. "Do you really think we can make it work?" she asked softly. Clark met her gaze, his eyes steady. "We will," he said. "It won't be easy, and it won't be safe, but it will be ours. A place where no one can brand us, or own us, or take what doesn't belong to them. We build it from the ground up." Ellie nodded, her lips curving into a faint, genuine smile for the first time since Clark had found her in the canyon. The smile was small but significant, a symbol of resilience and hope. Clark felt a rare warmth in his chest, a stark contrast to the solitude and grief that had dominated his life for so long. He realized that his journey of isolation had prepared him for this moment. The skills, discipline, and patience that had kept him alive were now tools to protect others, to create a sanctuary amid the harshness of the wasteland. Night fell fully, and Clark built a small fire near the spring. He tended it carefully, placing rocks around the flames to prevent any sparks from escaping. Ellie helped, gathering kindling and small branches, and together they worked in quiet harmony. The fire illuminated their faces, revealing the scars of their past struggles and the determination that bound them together. Words were unnecessary. Their shared experiences, their triumphs and survival, created a bond deeper than any spoken promise. As the stars emerged in the vast sky above, Clark reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He had been a man who avoided life, who buried grief beneath walls of isolation and routine. He had sworn never to intervene, never to face suffering that was not his own. Yet fate had introduced him to Ellie, a girl marked by cruelty, and in protecting her, he had rediscovered purpose, courage, and the capacity for compassion. The world had not been safe, and it never would be, but in this hidden valley, they could carve out a haven, one life and one refuge at a time. Ellie, leaning against a rock, traced the letters burned into her stomach, R07. The memory of pain remained, but it no longer defined her. Clark watched her, realizing that freedom was not merely the absence of captors, but the presence of choice, safety, and agency. He understood that the small sanctuary they would build was not only for her, but for every life that had been touched by cruelty, a place where whispers of fear could transform into murmurs of hope. The fire crackled, wind whispered through the canyon, and the night stretched endlessly above them. Clark and Ellie made plans quietly, discussing cabins, gardens, and watchpoints, knowing they would have to work diligently, cautiously, and with unwavering vigilance. Yet, there was no panic, no dread, only determination and the faint, comforting knowledge that the future, though uncertain, belonged to them. In the early hours before dawn, Ellie whispered again, almost to herself, "Don't wait for sundown." Clark smiled faintly, understanding the resonance of those words now. They had survived the darkness, faced monsters, and reclaimed agency over their lives. And in the silence of the canyon, with the first light brushing the cliffs, he knew that someone, somewhere, would always hear such a whisper and answer with the dawn. Clark Hudson, the recluse who had once fled from the world, had built a new life, not of solitude but of purpose. Ellie, the girl once marked and broken, had found freedom, safety, and trust. Together, they stood in the quiet of the wasteland, not as victims or bystanders, but as guardians of a fragile, precious hope. Their names were unknown to the world, but their actions spoke louder than fame or recognition. In that hidden valley, a new chapter had begun, a life dedicated to protection, survival, and the promise that whispers of terror would always meet courage in response.